Good evening. Hi, this is
Hi.
Philip White. I'm here with Warren Hammonds,
Hello.
my co-host for White Feather Counsel of Men. We are so happy that you chose to take this time, not to see it as robbery of your time, but to join us in reference to our discussions relating to many issues in regard to restorative justice, oppression, systemic biases, the healthy components of men, and a variety of things relating to just trying to bring men as well as boys, young men, together in a more balanced, healthy way here in America. So we are going to open up this evening with some material, some books, some things that we have gathered over the years individually in our lives that are important to us, that we feel is important to this work that we're doing here today, that we want to share with you. And we want you also, if you have some material that you feel will be useful to the work that we're doing here, to share that with us as well. You could put it on the email. You could send an email to us to wfcancelofmen@gmail.com, or you could come on the chat. We're live here this evening. You could put it in the chat for us to be able to have as a reference as well, because we want to be able to share as well as for you to share with us about things that you feel can help make this impactful for all of us as we share together. So I'm going to turn it over to Warren now to begin this presentation.
Well, thanks. And I do encourage you to, if anything that we say will sort of prompt your thinking as far as resources and books or materials that you've come about that have meant a lot to you in your journey in some of these matters, please feel free to share those, and we might be able to, again, relate those to other people at the end as well. I am glad that we're spending a little bit of time in this. We're not going to go very much in depth, but we will bring several resources that have meant a lot, that have meant something to each of us. And I just think it's important as we learn about other matters, as we explore others' experiences, it is important for us to read other material. It's important for us as far as our growth. Usually it broadens our minds and it opens our minds to consider new ways of thinking. Sometimes it gives me, when I read materials, it gives me words that better express either what I'm feeling or maybe what I ought to feel. So there are lots of good reasons that we should explore the reading of other people. So when you come about those, please share those with us, and I hope some of these will be meaningful to you as well. I'm going to start by sharing two resources. They're quite similar in nature, but although very differently written and a little bit differently presented. One of them is a large book that I'll say just a bit about in just a moment, but it's Uprooting Racism by Paul Kivel. And another book that I will start with is called The Little Book, and you can see it is quite little, The Little Book of Racial Healing. It is by two authors, Thomas Norman DeWolf and Jodis Geddes. DeWolf's interest in writing this book actually comes from his own experience and research in finding out that his direct descendants were slave traders, slave holders, and that was a very formative moment for him, and he began to explore what that meant within his life and within other people's lives. It's also, this little book of racial healing is part of a series of 8 or 10 books that are called Little Books of something, and it's all part of the Little Books of Justice and Peace Building series. You will see, I don't know if you can see on the Zoom, but the subtitle is Coming to the Table for Truth-Telling, Liberation, and Transformation. And it is also sort of a series of emphasis that both of these authors participate in. In fact, they created the Coming to the Table network or process of dealing with hard issues that we should discuss together. Both books challenge a conventional understanding of what we might learn in the world, And they both challenge us as far as we consider what we do about racial reconciliation, racial justice in the world. I'll come back to the little book in just a moment, but a little bit more about Uprooting Racism by Paul Kivel, subtitled How White People Can Work for Racial Justice. So it is, as you can see, a very in-depth book, whereas the little book deals specifically with white culture, white dominance, over against what that has created for African American culture and society. Uprooting Racism does that, but also includes other cultures that have been greatly affected by white dominance. And so it goes into a little more detail. But where I like both of these books is that they both start with history, and they both challenge us to think that history, yes, as far back as slavery, but the history of trauma that white dominance, discrimination, cruelty, and violence on the part of white culture how that has impacted other people. And so they deal with systemic racism, restorative justice, white privilege, a lot of heavy issues that we will explore in coming weeks or months as we dialogue with you together. But they go beyond that. They don't just send us on a guilt trip. They both offer relevant and practical ways of working toward justice and working toward reconciliation, even to the extent of offering questions, exercise materials, conversation starters that will help individuals and groups deal with aspects of working toward reconciliation, justice, and those issues. A few things that I'd like to read from each of those. I'll let you know how quickly Paul Kivel starts out. He's a little bit more challenging, I might even say somewhat confrontational, but not overly confrontational. But here's how he starts with his definition of racism that I think is very important and has meant a lot to me as I began to explore some of these conversations. I define racism, also referred to as white supremacy, as pervasive, deep-rooted, and long-standing exploitation, control, and violence directed at people of color. The benefits and entitlements of racism accrue to white people, particularly to a white, Christian, male-dominated ruling class. Racism is an uneven and unfair distribution of power, privilege, land, and material goods favoring white people, a system in which people of color as a group are exploited and oppressed by white people as a group. So we come quickly face to face with what he's going to deal with. But again, he doesn't just leave it there. He does give us some great examples and great reasons to begin to work toward justice and reconciliation and racial healing. So that's a little bit from that book. From the little book of racial healing, DeWolf and Geddes hone in very quickly on the aspect of trauma, the trauma that white supremacy, that white dominance has created and has caused in our world. But again, they go beyond that to offer healing techniques or healing suggestions, because what they do remind us of is that unhealed trauma results in continued cycles of victimhood and violence, and they are after correcting that. And here's a little bit about how they offer it, some very simple ways, but again, challenging ways. Sitting in a circle with other people committed to racial healing and exploring experiences and values is a form of taking action. Becoming more knowledgeable about trauma and its impact and learning to be resilient in the face of trauma is a form of taking action. Learning about how justice can be achieved in ways that are restorative and transformative is a form of taking action. All of these require action on your part to move forward in this racial healing journey. So those are two resources, the Little Book of Racial Healing and Uprooting Racism, that do similar things. They challenge, they try to correct, they do remind us how disruptive, worse than disruptive, that's a trivial word, how damaging and demeaning white oppression, white privilege, white dominance has been in our culture. But they want to move the needle, and they give us several ways to do that. So I wanted to start with those two. I'll come back and share one other resource that I brought, but now let's hear a little bit about what maybe Phil has brought to share.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. That in sharing these two very, very important books with us this evening kind of reminded me of the most recent incident that we just experienced in the country with the two legislators in Tennessee that were expelled from sitting into the Senate or the chambers of government there in Tennessee because of their protests about the gun violence that happened in Tennessee and the children and the faculty staff that were killed in Tennessee. And when we think about when oppression is to try to these were two young men in their 20s. When we talk about that generation of millennials or generational X people, that they are our next leaders in this country. Anyone over 40 probably can't relate or understand or speak their language, but they are the next leaders in this country, and we have got to be able to understand that. And that the decision to try to expel them from Congress, to shut them up by doing what they did, probably has brought more attention to these two young men in a very positive way. So sometimes what's meant to be harmful turns out to be good. And I think in reference to the books that you shared, is how we all have to. It shouldn't have to be something personal with you or someone that is lost in your family unit or your circle of friends before you realize that we as a collective people can do so much more better together than we can do separately. There's one book I wanted to share with you that I came across probably about 2 years ago by these two psychologists, Charlie Danielson and Randy Flood. And the book is called Massopathic. Massopathic is a term that they created in this book. And I don't know if you can see it, but massopathic is a term they created from their work with men over many years.
I'll hold it up.
Yeah, as it relates to the lack of sensitivity, the lack of being able to connect to their emotional side of themselves in a very healthy way. And it buys right back into, and we had discussed many weeks ago about this whole socialization process of men, and what they address in this book is how we have to, what they call re-socialization of boys and men, that we have to give boys and men the emotional freedom to be a complete human being. And for example, if you are sad, if you are feeling depressed, if you're in a moment where that your body sends you a signal that you need to release that, and one of the best ways that we can release stress is through tears, is to cry. It does a lot to be able to release that kind of emotion. And in our culture today, in regard to how generation after generation, how we have trained boys and men to look at an emotion like crying as something of weakness. See how far up we have gotten to the point that we can see something that is just as natural as breathing, that we would see that as an emotion that would be classified in our man box experiences as something of weakness. So they go very deep into their experience doing groups with men. They value it. They value the concept of doing groups. They think that men gather a lot from that group learning, that group engagement, in reference to working with men to bring about more substantial change in men in the long run. We got a lot of work to do. There's a lot of groups out here trying to address this issue. This group here with this book is doing that, and I found it very right in line with some of the things that I've come across over the years about this whole man box that we've been talking about in reference to. These are the things that men really need to research on and do it. So yeah, you may want to put this in and it's more part of your collection as far as books in regard to just understanding this whole culture of men. Remember, we started several weeks ago talking about it's not intentional in regard to us raising boys that become men in a way that's not productive, in a way that's not the best outcome. But we think we're doing what's right, when we train our boys at an early age to be kind of disconnected, to keep their feelings locked inside, to not share a lot, don't communicate well. All of those things we think somehow supposed to be helping us, but it's not. So being able now to have these honest, open discussions about this, hopefully we can begin to make some changes in regard to that. So that's one of the books that I hope that you will consider looking up in regard to Master Packard by Charlie Donaldson and Randy Floyd. It would be a good book to add to your list. Warren?
Yeah, I'll be glad to share another interesting resource that I brought. This might surprise you. For one, I do want to restate the first two resources that I brought. They are very personal books for me now because I'm beginning to embrace some of what they are offering. And I do think these materials have helped me understand deeper history's effects, history's impact, history's trauma, and maybe my part in it, even though I wasn't alive when all of what they were saying was about.
Right.
So it's helped me get a deeper understanding of maybe my role and maybe my role in the healing, of course. They've also helped me become a little bit more sensitive and aware of systems and institutions of dominance and of privilege, and just to become more aware of that. And then they've both also, because of how they're written, they've helped me consider what can I do, but not only what can I do, but what ought I do. So they've both challenged me to help move the needle somewhat, and participating in conversations such as this might be one way that we can explore that. The other book that I want to share with you, I'm almost embarrassed to share it because it should not be relevant today, but it still is. It is Why We Can't Wait by Martin Luther King Jr. It was written in 1963, 60 years ago. I think I first read this book in my early to mid-20s. So about 40 years ago is when I first became aware. I knew maybe of it before, but this is when I began to read it. As you can see, it's very small. It looks sort of insignificant, but the title is gripping. Why We Can't Wait. It's almost autobiographical in nature. King writes about the events and the forces and the pressures that were involved in the quest for civil rights in the early 60s. It's very short, it's very engaging, very riveting, gives a lot of personal examples of what police forces and government establishments are doing to still oppress. So it gets personal, and it tries to convince us all of the work that how important it was then to work toward justice, to work toward equality. He does a great job in this little book to remind us of the imbalances 60 years ago, the imbalances or the inequities that were found in education, job opportunities, housing, 60 years ago. And he also talked about the continued practices of discrimination, of hate and cruelty that made the struggle for that racial justice, racial reconciliation even more difficult and harder for him, his team, and the African American race. What's interesting is he challenges the church specifically, and more specifically, the white church and its leaders to be on the forefront of the movement, which I don't think churches really ever were. A couple were, but the church in a whole. To me, the hardest part about this book is that the title is still too relevant. And that's why we're doing this conversation. 60 years ago, I probably would have said, having a podcast, and podcast wasn't a word 60 years ago, but 60 years ago, I would have said, having groups work on things like racial reconciliation, it would be a disaster if we're still doing that in 60 years. Yeah. You know, we might have moved the needle. Some people say we've moved the needle a little bit. We've had an African-American president, so that means that we've arrived. Well, it certainly doesn't. Martin Luther King Jr. reminds us 60 years ago how critically important it was for us to be about the work of racial equality, racial reconciliation, and working toward justice. And these words are still relevant, sad to say. Relevant and challenging. Part of this book is his letter from the Birmingham jail that he wrote. And he actually uses, that's part of this book. And that's the part that I want to read just a little bit of. It's near the end of his book. And this is what he says about his little work here. If I have said anything in this letter that overstates the truth and indicates an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. If I have said anything that understates the truth and indicates my having a patience that allows me to settle for anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me. So there he is. He lays it out. He's calling for action now. He's calling for brotherhood, and I know that we might use that on this podcast because it's more specifically devoted to men. But he's after a collective work. He's after a conversation that matters. And he's after action that will matter in the lives of the African American people. Working toward true brotherhood is why we're here and why he wrote this book. And it's still important as we have these conversations. A couple of other resources just to throw out. There's you can Google anything on racial reconciliation resources. And what's interesting is you get a lot of primary, large institutions like Ohio State University, Michigan State University. So University of Michigan, there are a lot of there are a lot of colleges and universities that now have centers for racial justice that offer resources right there at our fingertips. And I know we've talked about one of those in Massachusetts early on. It's called the Change Center. And that's another resource. So books aren't the only resource, but they have certainly helped influence me. They've certainly helped shape me, transform part of me, and still challenge me to be a little bit more active in this world. Thanks.
Thank you, Juan.
How about more from your world, or how do you want to wrap it up?
Again, just from what you just shared about the resources around the country that's been trying to address this very serious issue about just the whole culture of boys and men. And the Men's Change Center is one of those organizations that have had boots on the ground addressing this issue. They are in Amherst, Massachusetts. And in 2005, right pretty close to the beginning when I started doing working with men at the local agency I was with at the time. Um, I received a letter from the executive director of the Men's Change Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. And it was a letter just basically speaking about their work, what they were doing to try to address all of these issues relating to the raising of boys and what kind of men they turn out to be. And the executive director at that point made this very pertinent statement in his letter. And I have that letter to this day that I've used. And this is what he said. He said this. He said that most men are not violent, yet most violence is committed by men. And it is in those twin realities that we must do this work. That's what he said. And that was in 2005 when he wrote that letter. It was a campaign letter to bring more attention to the work that they were doing there at the Change Center. But it wasn't just for Amherst, the people there in Amherst, Massachusetts. Their mission was to affect this entire country. That was in 2005, September 2005, when I got that letter. That most men aren't violent. Most men, if we think about all the men in America, most men are not violent, yet most violence is committed by men. And all of us, all men have to take ownership of that and to really just have a deep soul conversation with ourselves about what can we do as a collective group. This is too big for one or two people to try to address, even a center like the Men's Change Center, but us as a collective group of men, as well as bringing our boys along with us, because sooner or later they're going to be men. And we have got to begin to look at what are we doing right? How can we improve it? What are we doing wrong? We just had another shooting. What was in Louisville, Kentucky? Another young man in his early 20s. That somehow when we get in that emotional, deep, dark hole, the only thing that seems to rise to the surface of our minds to try to address feeling that way is to turn to violence. You know, and the question is, why is that always the remedy to something that we are experiencing personally? So, yeah, that's that. I love that quote. They said that most men aren't violent. Most men aren't violent. Warren is not a violent man. I'm not a violent man. There's probably a lot of men that may be listening to this podcast or we see on the street that has no violent bone in their body. Yet every day in America, somewhere, some man is doing an act of violence. So we have to take ownership of that. It doesn't have to be somebody we know. Just like I say, just like the young man there in Louisville, Kentucky. He's dead because the police killed him. You know, in regard to is that suicide by cop? But imagine how his family feels when a man does something as a single act of violence. It affects a lot of people. Not only the victims' families, but his own personal family's got to try to make sense of why would he do such a thing. And these are the kind of normal things that seem to be happening in our culture almost on a daily basis. And this brings me to this book that probably back in about 2002, I got this book as a gift from a coworker. We were just starting this fatherhood program at the agency, and she came in my office one day and said, "Hey, I got a book I want you to have." And it was a book by Robert Bly, B-L-Y, Robert Bly. It's a very old book. The book was authored kind of similar to the book that Warren shared about Dr. King. Was copyrighted in the 60s. And this book is, the title of it is Iron John. It's a book about men. And he talks about some of the rituals that we no longer do as far as raising boys with certain milestones, like when boys reach their teenage years. That was a ceremony. That was a recognition that we would do. That we got away as a country from having rituals that we bring boys along at a slower pace in regard to them stepping into each stage of their social development stage, from being a child to a boy, to a toddler, to a teenager, and moving on into adulthood. One of the biggest mistakes, personally, that I think we have made in this country, and Robert Bly talks about that in regard to bringing boys along at a pace that is kind of in conjunction with their physical development. is that when we, I've always said this one. I said it's just my childlike mind. Somebody told me I had a childlike mind sometime. That if I could be keen for a day, just keen for a day. If I could be keen for a day, one of my first rules that I would make in this country is to remove 18 as being an adult. I would strike that down. I would strike it down. I personally don't know any 18-year-olds that I would consider to be an adult. That's just me. I don't know any. When I see an 18-year-old, I just see an 18-year-old. Physiologically, we all know this. If you don't, that's let me tell you. From a physiological point of view, an 18-year-old is not completely physically developed. Now, most people know that our brain is the parts of our brain. It takes maybe 22 to 25 years before it fully develops, which is the frontal lobe of the brain. Guess what happens at that part of the brain? That's where we do all of our analytical thinking. That's where we make major decisions. And that's the part of our brain. So that young man that just recently did that killing there in recently here in Louisville, I think he was 25. So that's the first thing I thought about that in regard to his was his brain fully set down to where he can make more rational decisions? I don't know. But I think in regard to, and this was an exercise that I used to do, and people on this podcast, you may want to do this with teenagers in your lives, particularly teenagers between the age of 18 to maybe 20, 25, is to ask them, why do we go to making 18 an adult? Because back when I was a teenager, it used to be 21 before you became a full adult. Had all the legal rights of being quote unquote an adult. It was 21, but many teenagers don't understand what went behind that. That was a governmental decision. It wasn't that they were any brighter than any other group, but we was in a major war in Vietnam, and that's what brought about to have more young men that would be eligible to go off and fight a war in a foreign country. That's how they lowered the age from 21 to 18. And we haven't changed that. I think there is some rumblings by some legislators in Congress about even thinking about it, but I don't know if that'll ever change back. Probably won't. But, when we just think about some of these things that have been change brought about through different policies and things like that, was it in the best interest of us when we talk about boys and men that change was made? As I say, just for me, myself, I don't know any 18-year-olds that I would consider to be an adult. I just see them as 18. We hope that if you have some books that you think would be of interest to us, please share them with us. You can send them to us to the White Feather Counsel of Men email address, and that's at wfcounselofmen@gmail.com. You could also put it in the chat here on this live session, and we would love to be able to communicate with you in some form or fashion in regard to that. And before we close this evening, Warren, you have anything to say before we close?
No, I thank you for the opportunity to share some of the meaningful resources that have been meaningful to me, and that you have shared. And we encourage you just to reach out and seek resources, not just conversations, but conversations might be part of those resources. But different materials can be engaging, they can be challenging, and they can really help with formative experiences and give you some good insights as to how you can help change the world.
Yeah. And we'll close with this. A few weeks ago, we had an incident here. We are located in Central Virginia, and we had an incident of a young man that was born and raised here. He was 28 years old. He had a mental health problem. He had a mental health episode, and law enforcement was called. They intervened, and he ended up in jail. Then from jail, he was transported to a mental health facility in another section of Central Virginia, and there he died. He died, and in the hands of mental health and law enforcement, this young man, 28 years old. His family is from Kenya, I believe. Um, but he basically was raised here and attended school right here in Central Virginia, from elementary right on through high school. Um, so my church, it became a national event all over the country about this young man's death. And my church, First Baptist Church of South Richmond, hosted the funeral for this young man, and I was there to help just because we expected a large crowd, and it was. But there was this remarkable thing that happened during the service that I want to share with you before we close. Is that I was there to kind of usher in special guests and make sure they got to a room to sit and relax. They were going to procession in with all of the delegates and people that was there, for the dignitaries that was there for the service. And there was a young man, very tall, slender young man. I would say he was about 6'6" in height. He came up to me and said, "Hey, my name is not on the program, but I have been asked by the family to speak when they get to the session of having words from friends and family." And so I told him to go to the room. He was with his mother and father. And I told him, I said, "Well, let's get you to the room where the other dignitaries are and the preachers and people of that VIPs that you just come in with them." And so we got his parents seated in a way that they would be nearby. And when they got to the point of the service for people to speak about this young man, he was the first one to speak. And as this young man began to speak, he started to cry. He started crying. He had his notes in his hand. He was reading from them, and he started crying. He started crying. And I was sitting there going, "Oh my God, he's crying." And he didn't do what most men do when we are in a public setting, and that emotion that is in all of us just welled up in this young man, and he let those tears flow. And he didn't stop speaking from what he had written about his dear friend. He knew this young man from elementary school to middle school. They played basketball together in high school, AAU teams. They were very, very close. So he was in a period of public mourning for the loss of his friend. And he cried. He just cried. He just cried. And it was so refreshing to me to see that, to witness that in live time. This young man, I said, he was about the same age, about 27, 28 years of age. And I just felt I felt so proud of him that he could do that, because most men don't or won't do that. We just won't do it. And it's sad that we cannot let a very reality of our lives, that we're going to experience all kinds of events in our lives that's going to bring us down to our knees, that's going to create grief, that's going to create sadness, that's going to create loneliness, might even depression. All of these things is bound to happen at some stage in our lives. And for us to be so socially conditioned that we cannot release these hormones in our bodies that help to manage stress through our tears. You see? So I just want to leave you with that. And if you have sons, be very, very intentional not to try to limit them in their emotional health. Give them freedom. Don't be telling your boys don't cry. Men, get away from this term that Warren and I have talked about in previous sessions here about man up. We don't know what that means. We really don't. And we have to be able to free ourselves and just be a person. Your manhood is going to take care of itself. Just embrace your personhood. And if you need help, then get involved with a group. Hook up with us. We're here at least twice a month on bi-weekly basis. We'll be back on the 26th one. Is that right? We'll be back here with you live
26th.
on the 26th of this month. So, like I say, you got our email. Give us an email. We would love to talk to you. We definitely would love to get back with you. So that's how we want to end today. I shared with Juan that I wanted to share that with you because that was just so refreshing to see. And I feel better. I feel better about that generation, that they may be able to be better men than me as a whole, as far as our social development as boys and men. And hopefully for parents to buy into the concept that if you have a young boy that you're raising, be extremely careful how you try to chisel him to fit a definition of what will be his boyhood right into his so-called manhood. Be careful how you do that. So that's our session for tonight. We thank you so much.
Thanks
for joining us. And we look forward to your support. Please subscribe to our podcast channel. We would truly appreciate that, and share it with your friends about what we're doing here. We are serious about our mission here is to speak directly to men, so we can create a culture where we can be truly a brotherhood. We can be truly working towards that to help this country reach that state of a perfect union. So we thank you so much for being with us tonight, and we wish you well. Good night.
Good night.